August 7, 1943. 17,000 feet above the Solomon Sea. Flight Petty Officer First Class Hiroyoshi Nishizawa eased his Mitsubishi A6M0 into a gentle turn, eyes scanning the horizon for the American bomber formation intelligence had promised. Below him, 3 wingmen held formation, their aircraft gleaming in the tropical sun. Nishizawa, already credited with 43 kills, felt the familiar calm of a hunter who had never known fear in combat. Then his wingman's voice crackled through the radio, 2 words that would shatter everything he believed about air superiority. Twin Devils. High. Nishizawa's eyes snapped upward. For aircraft, strange and angular, descending from 25,000 feet like falling meteors. Twin-boomed fuselages. Twin engines. Moving faster than anything he had ever witnessed. His hand tightened on the control stick as his mind struggled to process the impossible. American fighters were supposed to be slower, clumsier. These were neither. In the next 40 seconds, 2 of his wingmen would be dead, and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the man Japanese pilots called the Devil of Rabaul, would learn that devils existed on both sides. The Pacific War had begun with Japan's air forces seemingly invincible. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Singapore to the Dutch East Indies, Japanese naval aviators had swept all opposition from the sky. The Zero fighter, with its incredible range and maneuverability, had become a symbol of Japanese technological prowess and warrior spirit. Pilots like Nishizawa, trained for years in the demanding arts of aerial combat, believed absolutely in their superiority. They had earned that confidence through victory after victory. American pilots flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and early-model Wildcats had fallen before them like wheat before the scythe. By mid-1942, Japanese dominance seemed unchallengeable, destined to last for years. But across the Pacific, in factories and design studios scattered across America's industrial heartland, a response was taking shape. Engineers at Lockheed Aircraft Corporation had created something unprecedented, a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that could fly higher, faster, and farther than any single-engine aircraft in the sky. They called it the Lightning. To Japanese pilots who would face it, the name would prove grimly prophetic. The P-38 represented not just superior engineering but an entirely different philosophy of warfare. Where the Zero emphasized agility and pilot skill, the Lightning embodied industrial might and systematic technological advantage. The clash between these 2 fighters would determine far more than air superiority. It would decide the fate of empires. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa had been born into a Japan where the samurai code still resonated deeply through military culture. From his earliest training, he had absorbed the principles that made Japanese naval aviators feared across Asia: aggressive spirit, contempt for death, absolute commitment to victory through skill and courage. By 1943, at 23 years old, he had already achieved legendary status. His fellow pilots spoke of his uncanny ability to predict enemy movements, his deflection shooting that bordered on supernatural, his calm in the most chaotic battles. He flew with a confidence that came from never having met an opponent he couldn't defeat. That confidence, shared by thousands of Japanese pilots, was about to be systematically destroyed. The American aircraft that would accomplish this destruction had emerged from a 1937 Army Air Corps specification calling for a high-altitude interceptor. Designer Clarence Kelly Johnson and his Lockheed team had faced a seemingly impossible challenge: create a single-seat fighter with 2 engines that could climb to 40,000 feet, exceed 400 miles per hour, and carry enough fuel for missions spanning 1,000 miles or more. The solution they devised looked like nothing else in the sky. Twin Allison V12-10 engines mounted in long booms extending rearward from a central nacelle housing the pilot and armament. Twin vertical stabilizers connected by a horizontal tailplane. The configuration gave the aircraft its distinctive silhouette and extraordinary performance characteristics that would rewrite the rules of aerial combat. The P-38's twin engines were masterpieces of American engineering. Each produced 1,150 horsepower boosted by turbochargers that maintained power output to altitudes where other engines gasped and faltered. While the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine lost power dramatically above 15,000 feet, the Lightning's Allisons kept pushing, kept climbing, kept accelerating. This advantage in the vertical dimension would prove absolutely decisive. Japanese pilots trained to fight in turning, slashing dogfights would find themselves battling an enemy that refused to fight on their terms, an enemy that attacked from heights they could not reach and escaped at speeds they could not match. The psychological impact would be as devastating as the physical destruction. By late 1942, the first P-38 fighter groups were deploying to the Pacific Theater. Initial mechanical problems, engine overheating, turbocharger failures, cockpit temperature extremes, delayed their combat debut. American pilots, many transitioning from P-40 Warhawks, needed time to master the Lightning's complexities, twin-engine management, engine-out procedures, high-altitude oxygen systems. But as these issues were resolved and pilot proficiency increased, Japanese forces across the Pacific began encountering a fighter that seemed to violate every assumption they held about American aviation. Intelligence reports filtering back to Rabaul and other major Japanese bases spoke of twin-engine American fighters engaging Zeros at altitudes above 25,000 feet. Japanese commanders initially dismissed these reports as exaggeration or misidentification. How could a twin-engine aircraft, presumably heavy and sluggish, pose a threat to the nimble Zero? This failure to take the threat seriously would cost Japan dearly. The first large-scale engagements between P-38s and Zeros occurred over Guadalcanal in late 1942 and intensified through 1943. For Japanese pilots like Nishizawa, these encounters were profoundly disorienting. The P-38s appeared without warning, often diving from altitudes the Zero could barely reach. They struck with devastating speed, .450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon firing in a concentrated stream from the nose. No wing-mounted weapons requiring convergence calculations. No spread pattern. Just a focused torrent of destruction. Then, before Zero pilots could react, the Lightnings would be gone, zooming back to altitude using speed and power the Zero simply could not match. Japanese pilots found themselves unable to engage on anything resembling equal terms. Every tactical advantage they had cultivated, tight turning radius, slow speed maneuverability, aggressive pursuit, became irrelevant against an enemy that fought from a different dimension entirely. The tactical revolution the P-38 represented can be understood through a simple comparison. The Zero at low altitude could turn inside any Allied fighter then in service. Its legendary maneuverability came from minimal weight, achieved by eliminating armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy structure. Maximum speed was 332 miles per hour at its optimal altitude of 16,000 feet. Above that, performance degraded rapidly. The pilot sat unprotected, vulnerable to even small-caliber fire. The aircraft was a precision instrument designed for dogfighting in the traditional sense, close-in combat where skill and agility determined victory. The P-38, in contrast, represented industrial-age warfare. Maximum speed exceeded 400 miles per hour and remained high at extreme altitudes. Service ceiling reached 44,000 feet. The pilot sat in an armored cockpit behind self-sealing fuel tanks. The aircraft could absorb significant damage and continue flying on one engine. It was designed not for dogfighting but for energy tactics, using altitude and speed to dictate engagement terms. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa's education in these new realities began that August day over the Solomon Sea. As the P-38s dove toward his formation, Nishizawa instinctively rolled left, preparing for a turning fight. His wingmen scattered, each seeking maneuver room. It was exactly the wrong response, but they had no training for this situation. The Lightnings ignored the turning Zeros entirely. Instead, they dove through the formation at nearly 500 miles per hour, guns blazing. Nishizawa's No. 3 exploded, wing tanks igniting in a fireball that tumbled toward the ocean. His No. 4 tried to dive away but the P-38s were faster even in vertical descent. More cannon fire. The Zero's tail section separated, tumbling lazily as the rest of the aircraft entered a terminal spin. Nishizawa himself lined up a shot on one Lightning as it flashed past, but before he could fire, the American pilot had pulled up into a climb so steep Nishizawa's Zero, already struggling at altitude, couldn't follow. 40 seconds after the engagement began, it was over. 2 Zeros destroyed. 0 P-38 losses. Nishizawa and his surviving wingman limped back to Rabaul, shaken in ways no previous combat had achieved. The psychological impact of encounters like this rippled through Japanese naval aviation. Pilots who had never questioned their superiority now flew with constant tension, knowing an attack could come from any direction, any altitude, with no warning. The P-38's turbocharged engines were relatively quiet compared to the Zero's distinctive high-pitched whine. Japanese pilots often didn't hear them approaching until cannon shells were already tearing through their aircraft. This sonic stealth added to the Lightning's psychological warfare value. Reports to higher command became increasingly desperate. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima reported that engaging P-38s was possible only under the most exceptional circumstances which unhappily seldom present themselves. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated ace, admitted that the Lightning's altitude advantage and speed made successful interception nearly impossible. These were not excuses or exaggerations. They were accurate assessments from experienced combat pilots facing technological realities they could not overcome. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and unsustainable for Japan. American P-38 pilots, many with 400 to 600 hours of training, arrived in theater with systematic instruction in energy tactics, gunnery, formation discipline, and high-altitude operations. They flew aircraft that could absorb damage and return home. When shot down over water, they could often be rescued by American submarine or flying boat forces. Japanese pilots, increasingly drawn from shortened training programs as experienced aviators were killed, arrived with less than half the flight time. They flew aircraft that offered no protection and often exploded when hit. When shot down over enemy-controlled waters, rescue was rare. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. America could afford losses and improve pilot quality simultaneously through its vast training infrastructure. Japan could do neither. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every new pilot sent to combat was less prepared than his predecessor. The most dramatic demonstration of P-38 superiority came on April 18, 1943, with Operation Vengeance, the mission to intercept and kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most revered military leader. American intelligence had decoded Japanese communications revealing Yamamoto's exact travel schedule. He would fly from Rabaul to Balele Airfield on the morning of April 18. Planning this interception required capabilities only the P-38 possessed. The distance was 435 miles over open ocean. The timing had to be precise to the minute. The mission required fighting through Zero escorts, destroying Yamamoto's bomber, and escaping before reinforcements arrived. Any other American fighter in theater lacked either the range, speed, or firepower to accomplish this. The P-38 had all three. 18 P-38s launched from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal at 7:13 in the morning. Major John Mitchell led, navigating at 50 feet above the ocean to avoid Japanese radar. After 90 minutes of precise flying, the formation climbed to intercept altitude. At exactly 9:34, they spotted Yamamoto's flight, two Mitsubishi G-4M bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. The next 4 minutes would change the course of the Pacific War. Captain Thomas Lanfear and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove toward the bombers while the rest of the formation engaged the Zero escorts. Yamamoto's aircraft attempted evasive maneuvers, but the P-38s were faster, more heavily armed, and perfectly positioned. Cannon fire raked the bomber's wing. The G-4M, notoriously vulnerable to fire and nicknamed the Flying Lighter by Allied pilots, ignited and crashed into the jungle. The second bomber was destroyed moments later. The P-38s then disengaged, using their superior speed to escape pursuing Zeros. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. American losses, 1 P-38. Japanese losses, 2 bombers, 1 Zero, and the irreplaceable symbol of their naval aviation. The death of Yamamoto accomplished more than removing a brilliant strategist. It shattered Japanese psychological confidence. Their most protected leader, traveling with elite fighter escorts, had been hunted down and killed with surgical precision by American fighters operating at the extreme edge of their range. This level of operational capability, precise intelligence, perfect navigation, overwhelming tactical execution, demonstrated that American forces possessed advantages far beyond individual aircraft performance. Japanese pilots realized they were facing not just superior fighters but a complete system of warfare they couldn't match: intelligence, logistics, training, tactics, and technology all integrated seamlessly. The warrior spirit Japanese culture revered so highly suddenly seemed inadequate, even naive, against such systematic superiority. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa continued fighting through 1943 and 1944, accumulating claims that would eventually exceed 87 victories, making him possibly Japan's highest-scoring ace. But his later combat reports reveal a transformed perspective. Where once he wrote confidently of pursuing and destroying enemy aircraft, his 1944 reports speak defensively, avoiding engagement, noting altitude disadvantages, describing increasingly desperate situations. In October 1944, he wrote to a friend, "The Americans own the sky now. We survive only when they choose not to see us. Our new pilots last days, sometimes hours. I teach them how to die bravely because teaching them to survive is impossible." This was not defeatism but cold assessment from a pilot who understood the technological and industrial chasm that had opened between the combatants. The P-38's impact extended far beyond individual combat. Its range allowed American forces to establish air superiority over vast regions of the Pacific. Japanese bases that had been safe from attack suddenly found P-38s overhead, escorting bombers or conducting fighter sweeps. No Japanese position was secure. The aircraft's versatility added to its strategic value. Photo reconnaissance variants stripped of weapons but retaining full performance characteristics photographed Japanese installations with impunity, flying too high and fast for interception. Fighter-bomber variants carried substantial bomb loads, attacking shipping and ground installations. Night fighter versions equipped with primitive radar hunted Japanese aircraft in darkness that had previously offered sanctuary. The P-38 wasn't just a fighter, it was a weapons system that dominated every aspect of the air war. As 1944 progressed, the quality gap in Japanese pilot skill reached catastrophic levels. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known to American pilots as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw over 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day for minimal American losses. While carrier-based F-6F Hellcats inflicted most of this destruction, the conditions that made it possible had been created by years of attrition against P-38s and other American fighters. Japan's experienced pilots were gone, killed in battles they couldn't win, flying aircraft they couldn't improve. Their replacements arrived with less than 100 hours of flight time, barely able to land on carriers, with no realistic chance against American pilots flying superior aircraft. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier force, sent a message before the battle that revealed everything: "Our pilots are not ready. They will die bravely, but they will die. The outcome is predetermined." The industrial dimension of American superiority became crushingly clear as the war continued. Lockheed produced over 10,000 P-38s with constant improvements to every system. Each new model addressed combat-identified weaknesses: hydraulically boosted ailerons to improve roll rate, improved cabin heating, upgraded engines, better turbochargers. The P-38L model entering service in mid-1944 was dramatically superior to the P-38E that first saw combat. Japan, meanwhile, could barely produce incremental improvements to the Zero. The A-6M5 model of 1943 had slightly better diving characteristics and marginally improved armor, but fundamentally remained the same aircraft that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Japanese industry, strangled by submarine blockades, lacked the materials, precision manufacturing capability, and design evolution to compete. Each American fighter generation widened the gap. Japan couldn't catch up because they were falling further behind with each production cycle. By 1945, Japanese defensive strategy had collapsed into desperate last-ditch tactics. Conventional air combat was acknowledged as hopeless. Kamikaze attacks, using pilots as guided weapons, represented Japan's admission that their aviators could accomplish more through suicide than through skill. P-38s and other American fighters tore through these attacks with brutal efficiency, shooting down suicide aircraft before they could reach their targets. Japanese training programs shortened to just weeks, teaching pilots only basic flying and navigation to their targets. There was no time for combat training because combat skill was irrelevant when facing P-38s. Young pilots wrote farewell letters knowing they wouldn't return, not because they lacked courage but because they lacked any tool to contest American air superiority. One pilot's recovered diary from April 1945 stated simply, "Tomorrow I will meet the twin-tailed fighters. I have 40 hours in aircraft. They have gods know how many. I have no ammunition for training. They have unlimited supplies. I have courage. They have everything else." The human cost of this technological mismatch was staggering. Japan lost over 30,000 pilots during the Pacific War, the vast majority in 1943 to 1945 when the quality gap was widest. These weren't just casualties, they were systematic slaughter of undertrained young men in obsolete aircraft facing enemies they had no realistic hope of defeating. American pilots later reported feeling less like warriors than executioners during the final year of the war. There was no honor in killing opponents so thoroughly outmatched. Yet the killing continued because Japan's military culture could not admit defeat, could not acknowledge that courage without capability was simply sacrifice without purpose. The P-38 and other American fighters became instruments of a historical lesson Japan was learning in the most painful way possible. Modern war is won by industrial capacity and technological superiority, not by warrior spirit alone. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese pilots revealed the full psychological devastation. Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and became an advocate for Japanese-American reconciliation, stated, "The P-38 destroyed more than aircraft and pilots. It destroyed our confidence, our doctrine, our understanding of warfare itself. We believed skill and spirit determined victory. The lightning proved we were living in the past. It wasn't personal, those American pilots were just doing their jobs, but the aircraft they flew represented a way of war we couldn't match. We had brought swords to a gunfight and convinced ourselves that swords were superior because we wielded them with pure hearts. Reality was unforgiving. This cultural reckoning extended beyond the military. Post-war Japan's transformation into a technological and industrial power was partly driven by the brutal lesson learned in the skies over the Pacific. In the modern world, technological excellence determines national survival. The P-38's technical specifications tell part of the story, but not all of it. Yes, it was faster, over 400 miles per hour versus the Zero's 332. Yes, it climbed better, 4,750 feet per minute versus the Zero's 3,100. Yes, it operated at higher altitudes, service ceiling of 44,000 feet versus 33,000. These numbers mattered, but the real advantage was systematic integration of multiple superiorities into a complete combat system. The P-38 was faster and better armed and better protected and had longer range and maintained performance at altitude and could absorb damage and had better pilot visibility and incorporated better radios for coordination. Every individual advantage multiplied the others. The Zero might match or exceed the P-38 in one or two characteristics, but combat isn't decided by single factors. It's decided by cumulative advantage. The P-38 possessed cumulative advantage so overwhelming that pilot skill became almost irrelevant. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the Devil of Rabaul, survived until October 1944, far longer than most of his contemporaries. His luck ran out not in combat but through the comprehensive destruction of Japanese logistics. He was traveling as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft when P-38s attacked. The transport, unarmed and slow, was destroyed easily. Japan's deadliest ace died helplessly, unable even to fight back, killed by the same twin-tailed fighters he had struggled against for over a year. There's bitter symbolism in that death, the ultimate warrior brought down not in single combat but as collateral damage in a war where individual prowess no longer mattered. American records don't even note which P-38 unit made the kill. To them, it was just another transport destroyed. To Japan, it was the loss of an irreplaceable symbol. The contrast illustrates everything about why Japan lost the air war. The lasting impact of the P-38 Lightning extends well beyond World War II. It influenced post-war aircraft design, demonstrating that twin-engine fighters could successfully fulfill roles previously reserved for single-engine aircraft. It proved that technological advantage could overcome numerical superiority, a lesson that shaped Cold War military planning. It demonstrated the value of systematic integration of multiple capabilities rather than specialization in single characteristics. For American military doctrine, the P-38 validated the principle that industrial capacity and technological innovation could create decisive advantages worth investing heavily in. For Japan, the Lightning remained a painful memory, a symbol of the moment when traditional warrior culture collided with industrial modernity and shattered completely. Even today, elderly Japanese veterans speak of the P-38 with a mixture of respect and residual fear. It represented not just a superior weapon but the realization that everything they believed about war, honor, and national strength had been wrong. The numbers summarize the story starkly. P-38 pilots destroyed over 1,800 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific Theater. Major Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, achieved every kill in P-38s. Major Thomas Maguire scored 38 victories, also exclusively in Lightnings. These two pilots alone destroyed more Japanese aircraft than entire Japanese fighter groups managed against American forces in the final 2 years of war. The loss ratios were similarly lopsided. In 1943, P-38 losses to 0 kills ran approximately 3-to-1 in favor of the Lightning. By 1945, the ratio exceeded 10-to-1 in some operations. Japanese pilot quality had degraded so severely that engagements weren't combat but slaughter. American pilots reported shooting down Japanese aircraft whose pilots appeared to barely know how to fly, let alone fight. This wasn't the face of war that military traditions celebrate. It was industrial attrition reduced to its most brutal, mechanical conclusion. The final months of the war saw P-38s operating almost unopposed over the Japanese home islands. American pilots flew wherever they wished, attacked whatever targets they chose, faced minimal opposition. Japanese aircraft stayed grounded to conserve fuel for final defense against invasion. When they did rise to fight, they lasted minutes. The psychological impact on Japanese civilian population was profound. People watched American aircraft flying overhead daily, completely dominating the sky, and understood at a visceral level that the war was lost. No amount of propaganda could counter the evidence of their own eyes. The twin-tailed fighters that had destroyed Japan's aerial forces were now ranging freely over the homeland, harbingers of the invasion everyone feared. In this way, the P-38 didn't just win air superiority, it broke the spirit of resistance by demonstrating absolute, undeniable technological dominance. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American occupation forces conducted extensive interviews with surviving Japanese pilots and commanders. These interviews, recorded and archived, provide extraordinary insight into the psychological impact of technological inferiority. Commander Masateko Kumiya, a staff officer who analyzed combat reports throughout the war, provided perhaps the most comprehensive assessment: "We lost the air war in 1943. Everything afterward was just dying slowly. The P-38 and other American fighters showed us that our entire approach to warfare was obsolete. We had trained for individual combat, cultivated warrior spirit, believed in qualitative superiority through dedication and skill. The Americans treated air war as engineering problem: build better aircraft, train pilots systematically, replace losses immediately, improve continuously. They were right. We were wrong. The cost of that error was everything. Looking back across 8 decades, the confrontation between the P-38 Lightning and Japanese naval aviation represents a historical inflection point where traditional military culture collided with industrial-age warfare. The Zero and its pilots embodied centuries of warrior tradition, individual skill, acceptance of death, spiritual strength, offensive aggression. The Lightning embodied modern systematic warfare, technological superiority, industrial production, pilot survivability, tactical discipline. The outcome was never in doubt once the industrial and technological disparities became clear. Japan had chosen to fight an industrial war with a warrior culture. They had brought magnificent courage to a contest where courage alone could not prevail. The P-38 didn't just defeat Japanese aircraft, it invalidated an entire philosophy of warfare. The shock Japanese pilots experienced wasn't just tactical or technological. It was civilizational. The final word belongs to the aircraft themselves. The Zero, beautiful in its minimalist elegance, represented the pinnacle of what could be achieved by sacrificing everything for performance. It was a perfect instrument for the war its designers imagined, short, decisive, emphasizing quality over quantity. The P-38, brutal in its functional asymmetry, represented what could be achieved when industrial capacity was directed by engineering pragmatism. It was designed for the war as it actually was, long, attritional, industrial. These were two philosophies made physical. Only one could prevail in the crucible of total war. The twin-tailed Lightning that streaked through Pacific skies carried with it not just bombs and bullets but the weight of industrial civilization asserting its dominance over the warrior traditions of the past. For the Japanese pilots who could not outrun or outclimb the P-38 Lightning, this was the most shocking revelation of all, that the future had arrived, and it flew faster, higher, and more relentlessly than courage alone could ever answer. Their bravery was never in question. Their doom was simply inevitable.